let's say God gives us a platform. Would we be content if he took it away? Or would we be content teaching those same things to a room full of people that no one ever sees? The difference between managing and stewarding the gifts God's given you and trying to seek to be a thing is, are you taking shortcuts to fame? And there are some shortcuts. You can be really, really super provocative online and quickly gain a following. And I think that's the difference between that and really saying, okay, God has given me a message here that I want to steward well.
Welcome to this episode of The Glass House. We are recording live at the Southern Baptist Convention at the Pastors Conference, so you might hear some background noise. We have Dan Darling on the show today, who is really a specialist in speaking on the subject of words and online presence in ministry. This has never been more important to talk about than today. Dan is the director of the Land Center for Cultural Engagement and assistant professor of faith and culture at Southwestern Seminary. So I love what we had to say today. You're going to hear multiple things.
The first thing you're going to hear is just the value of your inner life versus your online life, and just the difference and how that depth matters.
And then you're going to hear about the shortcuts to fame that are possible now through social media channels and the danger of taking the shortcut to fame, what it can do to you. Mm-hmm. And then finally, you're going to hear about flattery.
I love that part.
It's something that people don't talk about a lot. We talk a lot about gossip, very little about flattery. There's so much flattery that happens online, and it's just as deceptive and dangerous as gossip. So tune in and listen. A conversation we think is relevant for this moment. Dan has written a book called Away with Words, which is such a timely subject as we talk about how we use words, particularly online, and what that means for our ministries and what people think about us and the church. Lindley, you and I recently, we came across a quote from Jackie Hill Perry that we were like, wow, that kind of nails it. Yeah,
it was on Instagram, and she just had asked a question. Someone had asked her, why Twitter and not Instagram? And there's a long quote. You want me to read it?
Yeah, go ahead and read it.
I've actually thought a lot about the difference between the two. The very construction of Twitter leaves more room for toxicity. For one, it centers words. As Proverbs says, when words are many, transgression is not lacking. The retweet button takes something that's either small and blows it out of proportion or something harmful or ridiculous and spreads it to the masses. Instagram doesn't have the same virality to it. The more I've thought about it, I also think the absence of pictures might be the reason dehumanization is so easy to do. There's a different leap you have to take in your conscience to see a face, a smile, a family, a daughter, and still decide to sin against them verbally. On Twitter, you see words before you see people, so it's far easier to talk as if an image bearer isn't on the other side of your screen.
I love that because ministry is often conflict resolution, and we are learning something in this generation, and that is online conflict resolution isn't so great. And when we get in the room together, something changes. So, Dan, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm honored to be on here. I love the show and the concept of the show.
Well, why don't you kick it off here about why did you write this book about words, and why do you think people should read it? What led you to that project?
Well, it's really two reasons. One, I've always loved words, both reading words and shaping words as a writer. I've been a writer for most of my life, since like junior high. I had a teacher in junior high that told me that I could be a writer. She read some of my stuff, and when you're in middle school and you're a little awkward and trying to find your way in the world, to have a teacher say, here's something I think you're good at. So I just took that and run with it. And so I've always loved words. It also strikes me that, Christianity is a speaking faith, a speaking religion. We have a God who speaks. In the opening pages, God speaks to us. We don't have to guess what he thinks or what he's saying. And he's created us as his image bearers to be speaking people. One of the unique ways in which we image God is the way we communicate as humans. And we live in an age right now where it's never been easier to publish. When I was a kid, we used to get newspapers, 3 newspapers. And as I got older, I would try to write letters to the editor. There was a process to go through to be heard. Now you can just tweet, you can post Facebook, you can start a blog. I think a lot of that's good. I think it's leveled the playing field. A lot of voices that we didn't hear before, voices of the vulnerable. But there's also a lot of drawbacks. And I think for Christians, we have to ask ourselves, how do we use our words in this age? This is the age in which we live. We're not going back to the 1950s. We're not going to all suddenly become Amish. We live in a digital age. Right. So how do we as Christians, how do we live well in this age?
Well, Lily and I deal with this all the time. Just, in the position that I hold at Lifeway, we're constantly asked to comment on something or weigh in on something, or why are you not speaking out about that? And every time I think, why does the world need one more voice?
Yeah.
Why do we need everybody to weigh in on everything?
I don't feel that way.
Well, Lindley is
why are we not commenting? We need to be commenting.
Lindley's justice oriented, so she really, when something's not fair online, it really bothers her, which is pretty much every day something's not fair online.
It's been hard. I mean, because in his role, it's not my job, it's his job. And so it would be dangerous for me to get on there and try to defend. So it's just, we have to just sit back and receive it.
But as we sit here, tomorrow begins the Southern Baptist Convention, where microphones will be turned on.
Yes.
Tone will be heard. Awkwardness will happen.
Yes.
I think this is a fitting conversation for today. Just how do we speak and use words well?
Yeah, I think so. And we have to ask ourselves, I think it matters the medium that we're using. It matters who we are. And so you talked about the pressure, I think, to speak out all the time, especially for evangelical leaders, pastors' wives, that we have to speak out every time something happens. And sometimes it's good for us to do that. And sometimes it's in our wheelhouse. Sometimes it's within the things that we talk about in our knowledge base. But a lot of times there are things that are happening that are important. We may have opinions on them. We don't have to have a public statement on it. If you think about this, 20 years ago, I didn't know what some random person 5 states away thought about every major global crisis.
It's true.
But now we feel like, I got to have a statement. I have to say something. It could be when there's something going, and then there's the pressure of, why are evangelical leaders not saying this, or why are pastors not? And I always think, well, maybe they are saying stuff, but they're not saying it publicly. Maybe they're talking to their kids or their church, or they're talking to their wives about it in a private way. It doesn't mean they don't care.
Well, speak to pastors and pastors' wives a little bit, because that's ministry leaders who primarily we're aiming at with this podcast, that we love hitting everybody. Talk about the principles and the challenges of using social media. Like how do you coach people when they ask you, you've become somewhat of an expert in this field, how do I use these mediums well?
I think it's really important for leaders to understand the power of their words. When I look at like James 3, for instance, the opening part of James 3 says, people shouldn't be teachers. In other words, James is talking about the weight of being a Christian leader or influencer or whatever.
He says, do not presume to be a teacher. Like, don't just jump into it.
Right. And then the rest of the chapter is about our tongue. And I think those two things go together. I think what James is saying is that when you are in a position of influence, your words have weight. And so leaders, especially on social media, I think we should be engaged, because this is where the conversations are happening. I think it's good for us to be engaged, to see where our people are. Facebook, Twitter could be a good barometer of where people are on different things, see what's going on in their lives. But we have to be really wise about what we say, because we're modeling for people. We're not just communicating, we're modeling for people how to communicate. What leaders will do in moderation, their followers will do in excess. So by the way you speak, you're giving a permission structure for the people who follow you. And we need to think about this, like, as if we're in public. So if you have, let's say you only have 100 friends on Facebook, which is pretty easy to do. Well, imagine yourself in a room with 100 people and they've given you the mic. How would you speak? Now imagine you have 1,000 followers. Well, that's a pretty big auditorium. Some people have 10,000. That's a minor league baseball stadium. What if you have 100,000 followers? That's like the Rose Bowl, and they've given you the mic. What would you say in that moment? Or if you're having if you're having an interaction with somebody else who has a similar amount, this is like a public debate. So I think before we speak, we have to visualize what would I say in public. I'd probably moderate it if I could see the faces of the people I'm speaking to. So I think leaders have to be really wise. You're modeling for people how to speak. You're helping shape what you think is good, what you endorse, what you say. All matters.
I think it's nerve-wracking, honestly, to be in a position of authority and post anything. Lindley and I talk about this all the time. Like, she'll show me something she's about to post, or I will, and I'll be like, should I post this? And there's always that discussion of, well, what if somebody sees this in the background and assumes blank? Or what if someone doesn't like the way I'm dressed? Or
Tell the story about the Bible that you posted at like noon one day.
Perfect example.
Yeah.
So when Lifeway was going through a season of trauma, closing the stores and a lot of things happening, I came to the wheel, and in the middle of the day one day, I posted a picture of a beautiful brand new Bible we had just published. And someone saw that and criticized me. Why is the president of Lifeway, with all that's going on, sitting at his desk reading a Bible? He needs to be running the company. This is what we do. We publish Bibles.
And you're a Christian and you read your Bible. I mean, that's
obviously only before 8 a.m.
Right. But that was an eye-opening experience for me, because I realized that people were not only just watching what I was posting, but they were actually presuming about my motives, what was going on in my life, what I was and wasn't paying attention to. That was just a day where we talked about, gosh, you have to think so much about not just what you post, but when you post it and how it's going to be perceived.
Yeah, and I think for leaders, you have to understand a couple of things. One, you need to be wise about what you post and how you do it. And is it something that you feel is wise and good? You also have to understand, as a leader, there's automatically going to be people who don't like you and think the worst about you. It doesn't matter how good you are. I mean, it's like, this is one thing they talk about with professional athletes that's new in this age versus like the age when Jordan and those guys played, Barkley, that athletes see all the criticism all day on social media, and people can be vicious and rude and terrible. And Christians, unfortunately, are like that to each other. So I just think at some level we have to say, I'm going to shut out some of that noise. And, some criticism is good, but a lot of it's just in bad faith. Like you're criticizing someone for reading the Bible. It's kind of weird.
I really liked what Dan said just then. Good spiritual rhythms in your offline life give you substance in your online life. And I know even personally, you and I, Ben, have had conversations that to continue this podcast, we cannot continue to rely on our story of how our marriage fell apart or the grief moving from Colorado. Like, we really are going to have to read and continue to study and have some depth. I mean, we tell this to our kids, like, interesting people have hobbies and they like to read and learn. And so I think what he said there is really good.
Yeah, if you're all caught up in turmoil and difficulty and strife in your offline life, it's going to come into your online life. And I really appreciate the idea that the fruits of the Holy Spirit should live online just like they do when you're incarnational with people. Mm-hmm. And we forget that, as if we can be a voice online that's full of resentment and anger and frustration. But when we're in person, we're happy and joy and all these positive things.
You received a text recently that said, are you going to respond about something? And I jokingly said, yeah, I'm going to respond and say the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness. I mean, just start listing them off, because what response could you give that would have been helpful in that moment?
Well, because we have so many pastors listening, I always hated the moment when I came down off the pulpit and someone came up to me and said, I can't believe you didn't address blank. Why didn't you say something? As if I'm a coward for not speaking out on that subject. However, I know that if I address that subject, it's a can of worms. And it's going to distract our church and take us down a road of divisiveness. So as much as people want to drag us into every argument, I think as long as we keep our hearts pure, live a peaceable life, as Scripture says, we don't have to speak into all the turmoil.
Well, to your point, if you had addressed it, 50% of the people would have been upset that you did address it.
Right.
So, I mean, you really can't win in that argument. And it's not even that you don't have a stance. I mean, he talked about that. Just because we don't say something doesn't mean we don't have a stance, that we're not talking to our families about it. And so, when is the appropriate time to say something versus not say something? And you can't win.
There is the practical issue of you can only talk about so many things from the pulpit. I mean,
which should be the Bible and not your opinion on what's going on in the world.
And people don't realize that on Sunday morning, the pastor is getting bombarded by, can you make a quick announcement about volunteers in children's ministry? Can you say something about sanctity of human life? Are you going to mention what's going on in the election? All these things, and it gets overwhelming. And the average pastor, I think, says, you know what, I'm going to stick with the text.
You forgot the person that comes up and says, there was a typo in your slide.
Or that you said Barnabas instead of
Barabbas.
Paul. Or whatever. It's just... It's on and on and on. So you feel like you have to be a perfect communicator, and nobody is.
Yeah.
Nobody's a perfect communicator. So I think if we can be kind to ourselves in ministry and say, hey, we can't address everything, I'm going to address what God's called me to address. Speaking of interior and exterior life, John Wesley had a list of 22 questions that the Holy Club that he was involved in would ask. They were, I think, collegiate age. They were gathering every week to try to work on their personal holiness. And one of those questions, we'll put it in the show notes. Am I giving people the impression that I am more spiritual than I really am? And I believe that online environments give us the perfect opportunity to portray an image that we are some kind of elite, consistent Christian, when in reality, it's fits and starts.
I think the hardest question for me, because of my position, is when young moms come to me and say, tell me about your devotional life. Because that is such a hard age, and there's seasons, and there's job situations that are seasonal. And so, I mean, now it's consistent, but my kids are all teenagers and sleep till 10:30 in the morning. I mean, it's just so hard when people ask you, what about your private life? Because everybody's personal life is so different.
I remember a giant of the faith came to a seminary class, and it was one of those towering figures that you're like, I can't believe I get to ask this person questions. And someone said, would you please tell us about your devotional life? And I'll never forget, he said, no, I won't. And he said, why not? He goes, because I would be afraid you'd try to go and mimic what I do, and what I do is weird. And we finally got him to open up, and a big piece of his devotional life is he listens to classical music and meditates and prays. But he would never want anyone else to go and try to replicate that. I think that's the danger of exposing your interior life, and a lot of the things that you do is that other people get the impression that they should go and do those things also when they're built and wired differently. So I've always tried to be very gracious with people about the way they go about reading the Bible, the plans they use, the way they like to do it. Everybody's so different.
You and I cannot do the same thing.
Oh, that's a divorce waiting to happen.
Well, no, I'm just saying, like, we've laughed because I am now in the second year going through the Bible recap, and I really enjoy it. It keeps me, I'm a task, like, I need to check my box kind of thing. And Ben, I think, did it for 4 days. And no offense to the program, you're just, like, you have to do something different.
It blows my mind that anybody can read the Bible straight through verse by verse. And I am a lover of the Bible. That way of doing it drives me bananas.
Right. So that's what I'm saying. We can't even do it the same way.
That's funny.
When you were writing this and doing your research, I mean, what do you find is so much the motivation of social media? Because, I mean, I think we all have heard how to manage it, but I think, and myself included, I get skeptical when I see certain people post certain things because I'm like, are they just trying to, like, they're just trying to make a big deal of themselves? Or are they a big deal? I mean, you know, we just all think these things.
I talk a lot about that in the book, about we need to ask ourselves, why are we doing what we're doing? The internet has given us an opportunity to sort of create a version of ourselves,
yes,
and put it out there. And a lot of times that stems from insecurity because we are unhappy with the version that we really see in the mirror. And so you see people sort of curating a version of themselves. And this happens in a variety of ways. So the really angry person that fights all the time, maybe he's a person or she's a person that in real life, they never were seen as courageous. They never were seen as someone tough. And now they can create a version of themselves that's that, or they're trying to prove themselves. Or, you know, on places like Instagram where you're trying to create a version of this perfect house or this perfect mom or perfect person. And because I think we do that because we think that's the kind of image we need to portray so that we can find acceptance and we can find love. And I think the solution to that is that if we know who we are in Christ, that we are known by God and we know God, then we're free to kind of live online in a way that's authentic and we don't have to curate.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. I like to say that the quality of your offline life determines the quality of your online life. So if you have good spiritual rhythms in your life, then that'll translate to good practices online. Consequently, and I have this sort of like rule that I have with my friends that if I see someone acting really strangely online, whether they're angry or just tweeting just like really weird stuff or provocative things or other behaviors, I also often wonder what's going on.
Yeah. Something
else is going on because, you know, that can be almost like a fig leaf to mask the problems we're having in real life. It can be an escape hatch. So I think those are the things we have to ask ourselves. Like, why am I doing this?
Yeah, I almost think about it as a person in a swimming pool who's flailing their arms and splashing the water. Like they're asking for attention. Like they really need someone to pay attention to them because there's something going on that's scary. in their life. Because when you see erratic posts or someone has these really long threads and they're going off on something, almost always I wonder, like, this seems to be stemming from an enormous amount of fear.
Yeah. Well, and God sees the real version of us, and he loves us anyways. Not the curated version, not the perfectly, crafted Instagram photos with their family. And not that any of those things are bad. I'm not saying don't post all that stuff, but ask ourselves, why are we doing this? Am I trying to portray or project a version of myself that I feel will find acceptance and love?
Yeah.
I think it's just so hard to manage either way, because the perfectly crafted situation, people are cynical of it.
Yeah.
But then the ones that are just a mess and are like too authentic, you're kind of like, maybe they should keep their stuff at home. I mean, so it's impossible, I think, to manage. And so I get very concerned, just even for the younger generation that hasn't gotten through some of life without dealing with this, because I'm a 42-year-old woman who can't hardly deal with it some days. Like, how do I manage it?
We talked about this recently. There's so many ladies in particular who are influencers. Like, this has become a phenomenon. And when you see that online, someone all of a sudden is trying really hard to gain followers. Like, how does it make you feel as a woman? Does it make you feel insecure? Like, why am I not influencer?
Of course. I mean, everybody, I think, feels that way. And for a moment, I'm like, I should do this. And then I think, I don't have the time to do this. It's a lot of work. Like, it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of... I can't even have a voice memo on my phone because I dislike the sound of my voice so much. So I certainly can't point the camera at myself and talk.
It takes an enormous amount of energy and thought to build up a platform online.
And
like,
courage.
you have to be thinking about it all day, every day.
Yes.
And some people do it well.
Yes, they
and
do.
have used it for the glory of God. I think you have to ask yourself, what am I comfortable with? What am I made for? And some people do a lot more. I mean, I do think there's some people that broadcast a lot of their lives. I'm watching their Instagram reels and stuff. I'm like, that's a lot of your life. And then sometimes I get a little bit like, when I see some of this stuff, I'm like, that took a long time to set up. That candid photo probably took 47 shots. I do think there's a danger in sort of living online in sense that shapes our everything. And, Twitter is not real life. Instagram's not real life. It's a snapshot of life. Facebook's not real life. And I actually get comfort from the fact that, those of us that are more in the public eye and we're paying attention to these conversations. Then I go to church and it's like, none of these people know any of this stuff that happened. They don't know the last 15 controversies that happen online. They're trying to take their kids to school and, go to work and be faithful to the Lord. And that gives me comfort. Like, actually, there's a lot of normal people that aren't online 24/7.
Recently, something was released and he was like, the whole thing's blowing up. And I was like, actually, it's a very small portion, because all of our friends in Colorado have no idea what's going on.
Sure.
I mean, so you have to...
It's easy to exaggerate.
You do have to remember, like, in reality, it's a very small percentage.
But it feels like the whole world's blowing up because the people in my swim lane are going nuts.
Yeah.
But it just happens to be a really small swim lane.
Yeah.
There's something in your book that I want to ask you about. I love this concept. When talking about platform and Christian celebrity complex, you introduce a concept that's really interesting, cultivating obscurity.
Yeah.
That sounds very similar to Philippians chapter 2 in terms of considering others more important than yourself. How do we balance using influence and growing your personal platform with this idea of obscurity, which really is the discipleship call?
I mean, I think the platform conversation is so hard. And I try to talk about that in the book and how complicated it is, because on the one hand, you have so many people who are like anti-platform and celebrity Christians. Interestingly enough, a lot of those people will put up like podcasts and blogs about not being a celebrity. And I'm like,
but
do you not want people to listen? You do hope only 10 people listen so you don't become a celebrity? Anyways. So, but I do think it's something we have to think about. On the one hand, like, God has gifted people who are writers and speakers and do public ministry. And if you record a podcast like we're doing here, if you write a book, you're doing it with the intention, you think you have a message that God's given you. You want people to hear it. Like, when I write a book, I don't not want people to read it. At the same time, I think, living for that can be really toxic. I think of like when David, when he's numbering the people, why was that such a problem? I think he was trying to like figure out how big is our army, how big
he needed validation.
He needed validation. And so I think we have to, the idea of cultivating obscurity is to have parts of your life that are where you're living in obscurity. You're not in the public eye. You're not seeking fame. I think there's a difference between managing and stewarding your gifts well. Like Paul told Timothy, don't neglect the gift that you have. So step into your calling. Oswald Chambers talked about that.
And some people have been called to be a public witness.
Yes.
And to speak out.
And to write and speak in public. On the other hand, there's a kind of thinking of yourself higher than you ought to think and seeking fame, seeking this. We've always had people with platforms, so I don't think it's new. I mean, people talk about the danger of, pastors with platforms. But if you look back, I mean, Charles Spurgeon had a massive platform. He was preaching, he was writing sermons, he had newspapers. I'm glad because I get to read his stuff right now. So I'm glad people do have platforms. I mean, I think of the fact that Billy Graham had a massive platform, and because of that, my father became a Christian, and I'm a Christian. I think I'm grateful that guys like Alistair Begg and Chuck Swindoll had a big enough platform to be on the radio, so when I was in a formative time of my life, I could hear them.
Yeah.
I'm thankful that C.S. Lewis had a platform so his books could come to me, and
right.
Francis Schaeffer, and anybody that's influenced me. So, that stuff's good. But I do think living for the applause of men can be toxic, and we have to just understand, why are we doing this? And I think the way to manage that, if you're a pastor, if you're a public speaker, if you're a pastor's wife, if you're someone called to that, is to constantly surrender your gifts to the Lord and say, God's given me this. I just want to be faithful. I want to serve the church. And I try to think about that with my writing. I want to serve God's people in the best way that I can. And there's only 2 or 3 things that I can do well, so I'm going to do those things.
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
And what's interesting about that is that I wrestle with a lot of this, a lot of my time. And then I've just realized, our oldest daughter just graduated, and our youngest is going in at freshman year of high school. And I'm like, the people that God gave me to steward are in my home right now. And so I really need to focus on that. Absolutely. For a time being. And I can say, in all honesty, that has not been the key, the goal of my heart for a lot of years. There was more in there, and I've become so content with that, of just, it's going to fly by. And then at that point, I can see what happens long term.
And can we be content with, let's say God gives us a platform. Would we be content if he took it away? Or would we be content teaching those same things to a room full of people that no one ever sees?
Those are good questions.
Those are the questions. And I'm being faithful with what God called me to do. I also think the difference between managing and stewarding the gifts God's given you and trying to seek to be a thing is, are you taking shortcuts to fame? And there are some shortcuts. You can be really, really super provocative online and quickly gain a following. You can do things that are designed to get attention. And I think that's the difference between that and really saying, okay, God has given me a message here that I want to steward well.
That's good. I particularly liked what he just said about shortcuts to fame. I think when we think about longevity and fruitfulness in ministry, it's about every day doing the little things that bring compound interest over time. Mm-hmm. But because of this online community that we now have, people can make a shortcut and do something that draws attention to themselves, that they are suddenly important.
Do you remember months ago, I showed you a post from Priscilla Schauer, and it was a ballerina, and she was up on her toes, and one foot had the ballet shoe, so it looked perfect, like perfection, and the other foot had nothing on it, and it just showed you all the scars and the blisters and the wounds of that foot. And she just was making the point that there are no shortcuts to fame long term. It's a lot of hard work behind the scenes. And I thought that picture, that image was so powerful.
And I think Scripture over and over says we should be careful rushing to success too quickly. One of the qualifications of a pastor is that he should not be a new believer. He'll undergo the temptations of the enemy. I think that because people can suddenly shoot to meteoric success today, that I go back to the words of Abraham Lincoln, who said, if you want to test a man's character, do not give him adversity, give him success. Success too soon and a spotlight too soon will destroy a person's character. And what we see today is a person has a viral video or a unique way of saying something, and all of a sudden they are shot up to the top of the line, as if all the other parts of their theology and life are also settled. and they're not. You know, the Justin Bieber story is everywhere. You put a video out there, and all of a sudden you can be worldwide famous, and it happens. It really happens. It's like hitting the jackpot. And yet, have we not seen this time and time again that people who win the lottery or they have sudden success, it often is the thing that destroys their marriage, their life, their ministry, because too much too soon.
Right.
And so I think a big part of the fruit of the Holy Spirit is patience, being willing to wait for the things that you want until it's God's timing.
I guess I wonder if the people who have really giant platforms, I wonder if they're any happier. Because those people are just receiving all kinds of criticism all day long. I think that's what we don't even begin to understand.
There's an illusion that the larger the platform, the larger the happiness.
But the larger the platform, those people are typically, from the outside looking in, seeming to fall apart. And I guess they would be, because they receive so much criticism.
I think it's the quality of our interior life too, because when I think about James, where he talks about care for widows and orphans, but also remain unspotted from the world. You know, our public work, our public activism is only going to be as strong as our private, you know, spiritual disciplines. I think we also need time in the wilderness. You know, today, one of the things I fear about people coming out of seminary or people looking for ministry is this sort of, because we have social media, you can quickly start giving your opinions and think your authority instead of kind of that slow bake of time in the wilderness. If you think of all of the people that God called in the scriptures, they all had significant times of obscurity. I mean, Joseph, right? 14 years between his dream and when he was prime minister. Moses, 40 years in the wilderness. Even Paul. We think of Paul as like he rode to Damascus and automatically he's preaching to thousands. No, he had significant time in obscurity. I think of someone like Tim Keller, who we all know him. He's a household name. He's written a lot of books, but he pastored for a long time before anyone knew his name. And I think because of that, when that notoriety comes, you're able to handle it. I think very few people can handle fame and fortune early on in life. I mean, you think of all the people that have crashed and burned, whether it's in the ministry or just in pop culture, giving them tons of authority and responsibility and fame right away. It's a crushing burden to handle. We're not built to handle that.
Yeah. And one of the things we've heard loud and clear from our listeners, because a lot of our listeners are in smaller churches that don't have a killer website and don't have a podcast that reaches thousands, they actually appreciate it every time we mention the fact that what they do matters.
Absolutely.
And you don't have to be invited to a mega conference to speak in order to be meaningful in ministry. But the online thing does give you that impression that unless you're leading something that is massively influential in the world's eyes, it's not influential.
I pastored a really small church, and I remember I came from a big church and pastored a small church. And it was the kind of church I would drive past and think, okay. But then when I was there, I realized God is doing a great work in this small church.
A sweet fellowship.
And one of the things to keep in mind is that most of the body of Christ around the world are ordinary people.
Yep.
Who probably don't get a paycheck from a 501c3, don't have a book, don't have a podcast, don't have a byline anywhere. The kingdom of God is mostly made up of ordinary Christians, putting their yes on the table and saying, what does God want me to do?
We, yesterday, for fun with our kids, because we're in Anaheim, California, we went to the Warner Brothers tour that shows how they make movies. I had no idea how fake every single show is that I've watched. Every single one. And how it's all just an illusion. And the online experience is so much that. It's, believe me, as one now who has gotten to know a lot of these so-called celebrity Christians, they're far more ordinary than you realize.
Absolutely.
They're just normal people who happen to have written a great piece or are gifted at Bible study. But when you look at their actual everyday lives, it looks just like your life. And so we have this false impression that there's this superhuman Christian out there that writes everything they write is awesome and that they think everything they write is awesome when they don't. And they're struggling through the battle of celebrity, of being known as a public person, just like others battle in obscurity. I just think it's interesting.
Yeah, I think so. And like you said, the work we do in obscurity matters. Like I think of my dad as just, he was a lay person. He's a plumber, faithful elder. He's never gone to read a book or article or do any of that stuff, but a great man of God. And I admire folks like that. I think of pastors all around the world pastoring in small locations. They're never going to get invited to headline a conference. That's the real work.
Yeah.
And that God is I think we have to see that God is at work in the small things.
So a question, just as in your experience, what are some red flags that you have seen from people along the way when social media becomes too important
That's
to
a
them?
good
Like, how
question.
can we be aware of what's happening?
That's a great question. One, I think when I talk to someone and all their conversations are centered around, did you see what this person said or this or that? Like they're living in that world so much that it's identifying them. I think number two, they're online too much. They're tweeting a lot. They're constantly online. I wonder about pastors. Some pastors I see online. It's like all day. And
Who's
I'm like,
caring for the flock?
yeah, I'm like, who's caring for the flock? Where are their elders to say, bro, you need to pull this thing back? I also think another red flag is just this sort of constant seeking of attention. Making yourself a hero online or a victim, and trying to seek all that attention, I think is really toxic. And again, like the fruits of the Spirit. When I look at qualifications for leadership in the Bible, we often look at, the Bible says, like in the pastoral, is he gifted to teach? Sure. Okay. That's important. And we often look at the moral questions. Are they faithful to their families? That's very important. But then the rest of the qualifications are all temperament, kindness, gentleness, not a quarreler, not a brawler. We overlook that.
Yes.
But to me, you can disqualify yourself from ministry by the way you act online, by not having those, working on those traits. And I will say this, for a church, they say that the church's website is the new front door. I think the pastor's social media is a new front door, because people will watch the way you interact as
Absolutely,
a pastor
they
online,
will.
and they will say, I'm not going to go to that church because of the way this guy conducts himself, or because of the way this worship leader conducts themselves, or the youth pastor, or the pastor's wife, or whatever. So I think those are very important.
Those are good. I think what's interesting about that is we had an elderly woman tell us early in our ministry that when you take a little dig, you lose a little ground.
She told us that her kids, she helped raise our children, and she told them that, and they remembered it.
I can't tell you how many times I've lost respect for someone online because they took a dig. Like, why did you do that? Like, just take the high road.
Take the high road. The Bible says too, 1 Corinthians 13 says, love believes all things. We need to give people the benefit of the doubt. So don't assume malice with somebody. So the CEO of Lifeway has his Bible open. Don't assume he's doing something cynical. Maybe just assume he's reading his Bible.
Or assume maybe he scheduled that.
Yeah, yes.
Because a lot of social media is scheduled.
Yeah. Don't assume things. We do this as Christians, like, oh, they're just trying to whatever. And it's like, we don't know that. We don't know their hearts. Let's give people the benefit. It doesn't mean you're naive, but we should.
That's
Love
really good.
believes all things.
Yeah, one thing that we had talked about for this interview is that you talk about flattery. And Ben years ago preached something. What did you say? It was in regards to gossip and flattery.
I totally stole it from someone. I don't even remember who I stole it from, but he said that gossip is when you say behind someone's back what you would never say to their face. And flattery is when you say to someone's face what you would never say behind their back.
That's really good.
And I have seen so much flattery online. I actually am the recipient of flattery. As being a public leader, people will say really kind things about me, and I think, bro, we've had one experience together.
Or
you don't even know me.
why don't you just text me that? I mean, sometimes he's like, could you just privately text me that?
It means so much more to me if someone sends a personal, private word of encouragement than when they post it online. Because then I have to question their motives. Like, are you trying to show yourself publicly aligned with me for some reason? I just wonder why he's doing that.
Like, I think that's such a great point, because I think sometimes it's a desire to it's like a tribal marker, either the cynicism or the flattery. It's to say, I'm with this person. I want everyone to know. I see this so much. People, the tendency to attach yourself to some really famous person and say, this person is the greatest thing ever, and I think there's some motivations there beyond just wanting to encourage people. I think the one thing I will say is all the algorithms promote division, all the algorithms, there's perverse incentives on social media, but we don't have to live that way. As Christians, we can use social media for good, and we could use it to lift up people, to encourage folks, to send a private message and say, man, I really read that and that was really great, or I love what you're doing here. let's, as Christians, we can reverse this. We don't have to live by the rules that the world makes for all these.
You know, one of the things I think is such a huge opportunity with social media is to choose as your favorites list the people in your own flock.
Yeah.
Their feeds come up first. So-and-so's having a baby. Oh, they had a birthday party. That's the stuff that pastors, I think, should be paying attention to. Like, these are the actual events of people's lives, and I want to be in tune with what's happening. Rather than, we heard this statement years ago that success is when the people who know you best respect you the most.
That's so good.
Putting those people who know you the most in your feed first, I think balances out some of that outside noise that tends to get the attention. You're spending so much time entertaining strangers and what they think, rather than the people who actually know you.
There's so much conversation about gossip in the Christian church, but not really in anything about flattery. What was your thought about that?
Well, I think both are equally evil because they're lies. Gossip is saying behind someone's back something you never say to their face. So, like, if you don't have the courage to say to their face, why are you saying it behind their back? And then flattery is a form of deception. It's, I want to say something really kind to you because there's a motive or there's something I want from you, and buttering you up gets me closer to that goal. And online, there's so much flattery. I always appreciate a compliment. Who doesn't?
Right.
But I've actually come to the moment in my life where I question the motives behind a lot of compliments.
I actually don't like a compliment.
You don't?
when you say to me, like,
you immediately think it's...
Well, you'll say, oh, you look nice. And I'm like, shut up.
You have to say that. You're my husband.
Yeah. And I mean, Ava does the same thing. So, we just laugh about it.
Well, I'm a person that likes praise.
Right. You are.
I'm
Words
a
of
words
affirmation.
person. Like, it means a lot when someone comes up and says, hey, that sermon really impacted me, and they tell me specifically why. But there's something about online. I always say this, like, if you want to give me a compliment, just send me a personal note. That means the world to me. I save those notes. They mean a lot to me. But when you put it online for the whole world to see, all of a sudden I'm asking, why isn't this between you and me? Why is it between you and me and the whole world now?
Well, we have this debate every birthday, anniversary, Mother's Day, Father's Day, because I'll say, are you going to post anything? And he's like, I love you. And I'm going to tell you face to face and write you a card that no one is going to read to show my love for you. I don't have to tell the world that you're the best wife to me.
It just feels cheap to me. It feels like I'm telling the whole world, because I really want them to think I'm a great husband. So I'm going to tell that publicly so that everybody else thinks, wow, he's an amazing wordsmith.
It's not that it's wrong.
Why
it's
not
just
just
what's the
tell
motive?
you to your face, and then it feels more genuine.
Right.
So I think what Dan says is great about, like, why is this person doing this? Why am I doing this? Why do I feel a need to post this? Or why do I feel an urgency around it? Those are the right questions.
So we ask all our guests, what is the worst thing about living in the glass house in your experience?
I think the worst thing about it is, one of the things you said, people who don't really know you assume your motivations, or just automatically will criticize you, or just say, oh yeah, they're just doing this because they're this or that. And it's like, you don't really actually know me. I think you just have to develop some thick skin for that. But still, it's kind of like, how do you know that this person is so malicious, or this is their motivation, right?
That's exactly right.
We were talking about this recently. We have changed our culture to you're guilty until proven innocent now, instead of innocent until proven guilty.
Something that's related to that is just, I think, the disunity among Christians, the tribalism, we're fighting over dumb things. There are things worth fighting for, orthodoxy, but we're fighting over dumb things. I mean, I see people who practically overlap on the Venn diagram in terms of their beliefs, who are at war with each other. And I'm like,
yep,
this is really dumb. I mean, I tell my kids, I have 4 kids, and I'm always constantly saying, don't argue over stupid things. Constantly telling them that. I'm like, I'm going to get t-shirts made up and make you guys wear these. So that I hate the disunity. And I think as Christians, how can we be unifiers online? How can we be people who say, I'm not going to take a side here on this dumb thing?
Okay, so flipping the coin, what is one of the great things about living in the glass house? Why is it worth it?
Well, one of the things that's really fulfilling is, if you're doing public ministry, is to see God use the work that you do. So like when you write, for instance, you write a book, you're sending it off into the world. You don't know you never know who's at the other end of your words when you're a writer. And so it's really cool to hear people say, yeah, I read your book and it really changed my life, or I read this, and the opportunity to do that kind of public ministry. And I think it helps me kind of see what I do as serving the church. And
that's true of
in that
preachers
way.
also.
It really
Your
is.
sermons get passed on to people, and you're like, wow, I had no idea that.
And they can live on. I mean, I'm reading books by, J.I. Packer and C.S. Lewis long after they're gone. And they took time to write that book. They listened to the call of God and they wrote that book. And I'm still being shaped by it. I read the biography of J.I. Packer, and someone said, hey, did you plan to write all this and do all this? He said, how did you become so prolific? And he said, people asked me and I did it. It was like really simple. They asked me to write this on this particular topic of the Bible, and I wanted to serve the church, and I did it. So I really find it fulfilling. I like meeting new people. I also think being in the public eye, you really do see how wonderful and good the church is. There's a lot of cynicism today about the church. There's a lot of cynicism about evangelicalism. I just don't share it. Yes, we have issues. Yes, we have problems. Yes, we have things we have to think through. But man, Christians are some good people. Everywhere you go in the world where there's human suffering, there's Christians there helping.
Yeah.
Everywhere you go. I've been hurt by the church, but I've also been helped by the church in incredible ways. And
we get to travel around and pop into all these SBC churches, and the experience over and over
it's
again
amazing.
Is loving reception,
Yeah.
kindness, thankfulness. It's not the same as what you see online.
Right. And what a great opportunity is to be in a leadership position, to be able to say, I'm going to serve and steward and lead in the body of Christ. As long as we hold it lightly and say, this was here before I got here, it's going to be here after I'm gone. I'm just trying to serve in my time in a faithful way.
Thank you so much for listening. If you're enjoying the podcast, would you consider leaving us a rating or a review wherever you listen to the show? It gives us insight into what you like, and it helps others find the show as well. The Glass House is hosted by Lifeway, produced and edited by Angie Elkins Media, original music by Robert Elkins, sound engineering by Dale Sandberg, and artwork by Cameron Spooner.